All of you here, this is a large turnout for these sort of things. I think put aging in the title, and all of my age cohort of homies. So I'm going to talk about meditation, the brain and aging this evening. And to begin, just point out that, as all of you I think are probably aware, there's a much larger number of people today in the West, including many of us who are older adults, who engage in the practice of meditation. And in a survey that was done by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Health and Public Life, published in 2007, 43% of adults over the age of 40 reported meditating at least once a week. I find that a remarkable number, given about where things were a decade or so ago. So, when asked by his students the question, why do we meditate, Shunryu Suzuki Roshi replied, so you can enjoy your old age. And so what I'd like to explore tonight is some of the science that may support that statement of Suzuki Roshi's. I want to begin by talking a little bit about cognitive function in aging. Something that my age and older, we all think a little bit about. We probably notice some things that seem a little different than when we were in our 20s. And maybe we have friends and relatives, spouses, others, who may be experiencing more severe cognitive difficulties with aging, and so we worry about ourselves. Many of the normative cognitive changes with aging, it seems, may reflect a reduction in this capacity that psychologists call working memory. This is a mental resource, you can think of it as, for simultaneous processing and storage of information. So when you look up a telephone number and then you dial it, that's using working memory. In reality, everything that we do uses working memory. We're always holding something temporarily in storage, operating upon it while we engage in various kinds of cognitive operations. And it turns out to be the case that this change in working memory with normal aging may be associated with a mild impairment in attentional processes, especially selective attention that focus upon particular things to the exclusion or suppression of other things. And this particular set of attentional processes involved in working memory seems to be quite impactful. So it's been estimated that considerable differences in the performance of much more complex kind of achievement tests have a lot of their variance explained by very small differences in working memory and these underlying attentional processes. So attention is a big deal as we age. Now, one of the areas that we see aging-related change most dramatically in things involving attention and working memory is whenever we're trying to do more than one thing at the same time, or what we now call multitasking. So we know today from a great deal of research that attention capacity really is limited. And so when we say we are multitasking, we're really not performing more than a single task at the same time, but we're relatively rapidly switching back and forth between tasks. And that rapid switching has both time and accuracy costs. And it also costs us in terms of what we call episodic memory, the kind of memory that allows us to remember and retrieve something, use it in other situations. So if you just take a look at this particular example here and try to read it line by line, not alternating between the different print densities of ink, you get some sense of how difficult that actually is. Yeah. Why? Because every time we shift, we're having to hold certain markers in mind while we move to the second task. And then we perform the operations we want to mentally on that other task. And then we have to do the reverse again. Hold the other task in mind, keep certain of its parameters identified while switching to the other. That's complex and it's costly. Now, there have been Recent studies on multitasking and aging, such as this one published in 2011 by Clapp and colleagues, where they did functional magnetic resonance imaging and found that multitasking led not only behaviorally to more significant working memory disruption in older adults, but that this seemed to be relatable to an interruption recovery failure. That is, a difficulty in switching back after an initial task switch was made. And it manifested as a difficulty in dynamically switching between functional brain networks. So there are procedures in fMRI where we can trace relationships between different functional networks, and these were found to be working differently with older age groups. Well, all of you who lead multitasking lives or have demands in your work or family life that require multitasking, know that your own perceived effort, your speed, and the stress you experience increases with the greater number of work interruptions. Okay? Not surprising to anybody and documented in studies of this kind. It's also the case that we've got a kind of vicious cycle going, because once that stress occurs and its consequent emotional arousal, that in and of itself further disrupts prefrontal cortex functional connectivity and performance while engaging in an attention shifting task. So the more the multitasking demands, the greater the stress, the more we get difficulty in shifting back. And by the way, this was demonstrated by Bruce McEwen and colleagues at Rockefeller University in a group of students who were undergoing 1 month of stress of preparation for a major exam. And it was reversible, but not for a month or so following this period of stressful preparation. So these things aren't permanent, but they can be long-lasting. Well, I want to talk a little bit about how we might consider meditation as a kind of attention training, and the ways in which this may be able to address some of the difficulties that I was just reviewing with you. So first of all, although there are myriad approaches to meditation and different kinds of meditation, it's not unreasonable to consider there to be two major modes of meditation. One of them we might refer to, as Lutz and colleagues have done, as focused attention meditation. A common example would be resting the attention on the breath, that kind of meditation. And as the mind wanders, as it inevitably will do, gently without judgment, releasing that attention to distraction, gently bringing the breath back to the focus. And it's a kind of training in being able to stabilize attention and release from distraction. A second mode of meditation we might call open monitoring meditation. And this often follows some period of training in focused attention meditation, where now, rather than resting attention on a particular focused object like the breath or a subvocalized mantra or something like that, what one does is opens the field of attention, maintaining that same attentional stability that was cultivated in focused attention meditation, but now allowing whatever arises in the mental continuum to come and pass away without reaching forward to grab it, without clinging to it as it disappears. Again, a kind of attention training, in this case one of being able to remain available to all that may arise, both externally and internally, but with that same gesture of non-judgmental openness, non-grasping. Okay? Well, I think all of you, by virtue of being here tonight, are aware that meditative traditions and Western science have been in some fairly intense dialogue, really for the past 25 years, and with an accelerated pace recently. this photo of myself here with the person you'll all recognize as Yoda from the Star Wars trilogy was from a conference that I organized in New York back in October at Rockefeller, focusing on meditation and healthcare. And this is just one of a number. This was like the 25th of such conferences involving the Dalai Lama and Western scientists and clinicians that has been held by this organization, the Mind and Life Institute. There's a chair right up in front here. Please come on in. That I've been interacting with for some time, and that facilitates research in this area. Hi, welcome. So, if we take a look at scientific research on meditation and just limit, as Maya Dur did in this 2011 report, to studies that focused on mindfulness meditation, a particular kind of meditative approach, or mindfulness-based stress reduction, a westernized version of mindfulness meditation and some other procedures, 8-week training used in a number of clinical settings now. In this 4-year period of 2000 to 2004, 69 papers published, and that already was a considerable increase from the decade that was before that. But look what happens now for the mindfulness meditation publications for the subsequent 4-year period, jumping up really remarkably. And the same sort of thing for papers on MBSR. So this is a logarithmically increasing rate of publication, and also reflected in the funding for this kind of work through primarily the NIH. Well, how does meditation, mindfulness meditation in particular, relate to attention? As I describe these different meditation approaches, you might anticipate that one particular capacity or ability that might be cultivated is this ability to release from distraction or the processing of anything that we have going on right in the moment of time. As we move to the next moment, being able to let that go and prepare for what new is coming in. A lot of evidence from studies of working memory that that's really the foundational skill in working memory. We really don't vary between each other in a kind of capacity of working memory, that is the maximum number of items we could hold within it, but we do vary in the readiness with which we're able to let go of one thing in working memory to allow for something new to come in. And that seems to make for a large amount of difference between us. So in this study in the laboratory of Richie Davidson, excuse me, at the University of Wisconsin, the lead author being Helene Slater for this one, they looked at 17 individuals who were at the beginning and end of a 3-month mindfulness meditation retreat in comparison to 23 novices who meditated 20 minutes daily for 1 week prior to each experimental session, so that the control group wasn't doing something, completely outside of what the other group was doing, but they were not going to be as skilled at it. And they studied something called the attentional blink. Now, it's not a literal eye blink, as the illustration there might suggest, but it's a kind of attentional blink, or a missing of something attentionally. And here's how the task works. Individuals were shown a very rapidly changing series of letters and numbers occurring over just a single second, several of them in there, each one only lasting 50 milliseconds, 34 milliseconds between them, while their electroencephalogram was being recorded from this large array. It looks as though Mathieu Ricard, one of the participants in that, was at the beauty parlor that day, but that's what the electric cap looks like. And this task requires that individuals report any numbers that they had seen in that rapidly changing flash. Now, what had been noted in many previous studies using this is that if the two numbers were separated by a large number of letters, most people were able to report both the first and the second one. However, if only a few letters intervened, then the common observation was that people would report the first, but miss the second. Now, it was thought that this illustrated some kind of necessary refractory period of the nervous system, and that this was a necessary kind of limitation. It took a certain amount of time for attentional processes to recover after encoding one item to then be prepared and ready for the next one. But what this study showed was that, in fact, this seems to be rather plastic, so that the intensive retreat practitioners showed a smaller attentional blink for that second session after their retreat. So this is time point 1 and time point 2, the novices, the 3-month practitioners, when the letters have a short interval between them, where you'd expect a lot of them to be missed. And overall, of course, compared to when there's a long interval, more are missed. But look what happens after the retreat for the individuals who were in that retreat. They demonstrate a considerable improvement, up above 80% in their accuracy of detecting that second number. Furthermore, that was associated with event-related potential. This is a way of being able to look at the electrical signal of large averaged areas of the brain that are time-locked to the processing of a certain signal. It uses computer averaging to, if you will, squelch out or average out the noise, background EEG, and proportionately, therefore, amplify the signal that's related to the particular stimulus. Novices, practitioners, novices, time 1, time 2, really don't see much difference there. But look at the practitioners. For the second time point, after their retreat experience, for that response to the first stimulus, shown in the green here, what we observe is that they're demonstrating a faster return to baseline, as if that brain signal was saying the same sort of thing that we might anticipate based on the phenomenologic reports of meditators, that there is a more ready letting go of, or discontinuation of, or non-perseveration of processing, being ready for the next thing that comes into the mental continuum. Another project that provides some very relevant data is called the Shamatha Project. Cliff Saron is the lead neuroscientist on this project, and they took a look at individuals before and after a 3-month retreat intensive training of about 5 hours a day of meditation practice, primarily breath-focused kind of practice, called shamatha in this particular tradition. And in this study, they looked at visual discrimination and sustained attention, both before and after that training, in comparison to a control group that was randomly assigned to either receive the training first, 30 of them, or to serve as weightless controls, waited that 3 months, were tested again, and then they were moved into the training as a kind of within-study replication. What did they find? Well, the training produced improvements in visual discrimination, shown in this illustration here. Here's pre-training. By mid-training, you're already seeing a difference that's significant between the controls and the retreat participants, that maintains at post-training and at a 3-month follow-up period. And that was linked to or correlated with changes in perceptual sensitivity, as well as improved vigilance. Vigilance being our ability to rest our attention steadily over long periods of time. Again, something you might anticipate to be changed with meditation practice of this sort. Here, we're looking just at the weightless controls. We saw the same thing for the group that received the meditation training initially, but I put this illustration in just to show that the replication occurred with the weightless group also. Here was mid-training during that first retreat. Of course, they're just waiting. They're not getting any training. Here, post-training, you can see no real difference there. Prior to their entry into the retreat training, and now mid-training and post-training. So that vigilance performance significantly improving and then maintaining at post. Well, they also took a look at performance on a response inhibition task, published in another paper soon after that first one. And one of the things that they observed was that even though, as we anticipate for everybody in these kinds of tasks, there's a kind of decrement in performance across trial blocks. We fatigue a bit on this. But if we look at from pre to mid to post-training, significant improvement on this response and inhibition task. That is, if you have two competing stimuli, one of which is prependent based on your prior experience or conditioning that draws your response, how well are you able to withhold that response to a kind of dominant stimulus? Other thing that was interesting about this is that that improvement in focused attention predicted their level of self-report of enhanced emotion regulation and their sense of psychological well-being, as well as decreases in depression and anxiety self-report scores. So there seems to be a kind of linkage here between the degree to which that change in attention with practice is occasioning, or at least being correlated with, a change in one's emotion or emotion regulation. Studies that have been done, again using this procedure for examining functional connectivity, using functional magnetic resonance imaging, this time published by Wendy Hassenkamp and Larry Barcelou, both of them then at AMRIG, Wendy now one of the staff scientists at the Mind and Life Institute. What they found was that those individuals with more meditation experience demonstrated increased connectivity within attentional networks and between different regions specialized for attention subprocesses in these medial frontal regions, the middle front part of the brain. And they speculated that this might in fact be important for maintaining attention and disengaging from distraction. So not only do we see changes in performance, but correlated with the amount of meditation practice, we're seeing changes in brain connectivity related to attention. Well, all of this kind of work encouraged myself and my collaborators at the University of Washington, David Levy and Jake Wobrock and their graduate student, Marsha Ostergren, to examine the possibility of what we called mindful multitasking. Now this sounds like an oxymoron, yeah? But believe it or not, it was actually a proposal that the National Science Foundation funded of ours with that title in it, so apparently they didn't think it was so mishegods. Well, what we did, we recruited human resource professionals in both the San Francisco Bay Area and in Seattle. Did a lot of this while I was on sabbatical a few years ago up in the Pacific Northwest. We chose human resource professionals because we first of all wanted a middle-aged to older group of non-college students, working people, and we wanted individuals who were involved in heavily multitasking, intensive kinds of work. And human resource personnel, for any of you who know about that kind of work, satisfies that definition. These people are always in the midst of 10 different things at the same time. We compared 8 weeks of meditation training, small groups of individuals, because this was intended to be a proof of concept kind of study. Procedures in training developed by the now deceased San Francisco Zen teacher Darlene Cohn, shown here, sadly dying of cancer last year. And Darlene had published a book entitled The One Who Is Not Busy that caught our attention. It documented some of the training she was doing with business professionals, really attempting to bring contemplative practices into the work environment and be useful in dealing with the kinds of work stress we're all familiar with. So that was one of the groups. A second group received 8 weeks of progressive muscle relaxation and autogenic imagery training, and I'll tell you about some of the components of those things in a moment. And then we had an 8-week waitlist control that, following again like that other study I described to you, after their waiting period, then they went into the meditation training as a kind of built-in internal replication. There were no significant differences in age or in education between these groups, so the randomization was effective, at least in that regard. That's just a diagram to show what the design looks like. The group receiving meditation training tested before and after their training. The controls waiting for the equivalent amount of time, and then tested before and after that period of time, and then again after their period of 8 weeks of meditation training. And then the relaxation training group tested before and after their comparable length of training. The contemplative training involved practice in the ability to narrow or widen attentional focus at will and to rest attention in the present moment or task. That's all pretty standard for meditation practice. Also involves specific training in flexibly shifting focus from one thing to another, something of course very necessary in work environments. And then finally a number of different kinds of exercises to train ability to cultivate awareness of the breath and the body, as well as simultaneously with task objects. So trying to help people develop a grounding in the body while they're busy doing all of these other things. For the progressive muscle relaxation and autogenic imagery training, the focus was on systematically and deeply relaxing all skeletal muscle groups, aided by mental imagery, things like my arms are becoming heavy and warm. These are all, by the way, standard and much used and described in the research literature kind of procedures. Participants had the use of an audio CD containing daily relaxation exercises. They attended weekly classes for the same length and frequency as did the people in the meditation training group. And they also had the same contact with teachers and density of at-home practice as those in the meditation training. No differences in their logbook reported amount of practice. The critical test for this was a multitasking test that we developed. Most of the participants telling us that this was very reminiscent of their worst day from hell at the office. And so the scenario we told them was that they were to be actually helping us with the planning of a meeting having to do with healthcare, a conference on healthcare. And there were going to be 8 individuals who needed to come together as the planning committee. And so first of all, we wanted them to contact those individuals and schedule a meeting time, prepare and write an announcement with the agenda of the meeting, schedule the room reservation at the hotel where they were going to meet, and do a few other things, including completion of some self-report things that were occurring during the time that they were doing all of this. Now, of course, what they were doing was actually interacting with a computer that behaved as if it were these 8 people who they were bringing together for a meeting. And so, for example, as they would start contacting them by email or text messages, they would then get interrupted by other email coming in, by other instant messages, by phone calls initiated by the investigators who were sitting in an adjacent room. This was the graduate student assistant. By a knock on the door, and then the assistant comes in and stumbles around and knocks over a chair, and you get the picture. Okay. All right. So,
what time period were they given for this? 8 hours, or
no? This was a fixed hour.
1 hour.
Yeah. Okay. Fixed hour task. During the time that they're doing this, we're video recording, we're audio recording, and we're also collecting things like key delay data from the keyboard when they're doing messages and such. The pre and post training performance measures were taken from this complex multitasking test. And I'll show you the summary of some of those results. Most of them were time and persistence based. We also collected some self-report affect measures, the positive and negative affect scale and the profile of mood states, for those of you familiar with that, and also a measure of trait mindfulness, the mindful attention and awareness scale, another self-report instrument, both before and after these training periods. And these measures of self-report both before and after they performed this difficult task each time. What did we find? First of all, only those trained in meditation stayed on tasks longer and made fewer task switches. Now you might say, well, they were just laid back, they weren't getting anything done. Actually, no decrease in task accuracy or any greater total time to task completion. So they were as quick and as accurate as the others. The difference was they stayed on tasks they were working on for longer before they switched to attend to some interruption. Following the meditation training, those participants reported less negative emotion after task performance. Everybody demonstrated an increase in stress-related self-reports after the task. They found it stressful, as it was designed to be. But that degree of change from before to after the task was less after the meditation training compared with the relaxation and the waitlist groups. And by the way, this was replicated then for the waitlist group once they went into the meditation training. In addition, in this case, both the meditation and the relaxation groups reported less fatigue after task performance and also showed an improvement from before to after the training in memory for the tasks that they performed. We had a little memory task asking them about specific things that they did and experienced during the task. So even in environments that are designed to try to replicate the sort of attention that's necessary in complex work environments, it appears as though meditation training, at least of this kind, has an effect, and also an effect that seems, at least in terms of some aspects of performance and subjective experience, to be superior to training in bodily relaxation. Well, in addition to attention, another domain that we think is quite important as we age is our empathic ability. A number of studies have suggested that empathy in older age is related to a greater sense of life satisfaction, as well as a perception of more positive and meaningful social interactions. And now increasing number of studies demonstrating also an impact upon physical health. So not only is being empathic with others good for those other individuals, but it seems to be beneficial for oneself. The rapidly developing area of social neuroscience has been concerned with these social interaction-based kinds of phenomena and has studied with such procedures as functional magnetic resonance imaging empathy. One of the many studies now published by Lambatson and Vassetti in 2007 had participants observe the facial expression of another individual in pain. What they were told was that they were viewing a video of a person who had a rare auditory disorder, and the treatment for that disorder was to experience a repetitive, loud, sufficiently loud to be painful sound. And when the person was listening to that sound, they would be grimacing because sound was so loud it hurt. What they found was that participants doing that observing of this other individual in pain showed activation of the same brain areas involved in emotional or affective response to their own pain, particularly the anterior insula. That's an area here. If we pull away with retractors, the temporal lobe and the frontal and parietal lobes up above it, the insula is here, deeper folded within the cortex, as well as the anterior medial cingulate. That's an area shown right here in this cross-side section of the brain, and the amygdala, an area that is important, not shown in these illustrations, for a kind of self-relevance detection, especially important in fear, but that's not the only emotion that it participates in. The most important aspect of these kinds of studies is this demonstration that when we see others in pain, we seem to simulate their experience using the same brain systems that are being used when we experience our own pain. And it seems that this is a kind of involuntary response. doesn't require training. We see it in young children. Seems to be something we come into the world, as it were, fairly hardwired with. What does this have to do with meditation? Well, again, from the University of Wisconsin at Madison Laboratory, they studied expert Buddhist meditators. These are Tibetan Vajrayana meditators who are really highly experienced, 10,000 or more hours of meditation practice experience. These meditators demonstrated greater activation than novice meditators to emotional sounds, screams, cries, that sort of thing, in this insula empathy response, shown here, the blue being the novices, the red being the long-term meditators, much larger blood oxygen level dependent, bold response, while they were doing loving kindness or compassion meditation, a kind of meditation practice that doesn't focus upon some particular individual, but attempts to cultivate, generate loving kindness and compassion for all suffering beings. Well, none of us in this room are likely to have 10,000 hours of meditation experience, maybe a couple of you. So what are the possibilities for lesser amounts of practice having some kind of an impact on these things? And does that transfer to off the cushion when we're not meditating? So this is a very recent study that came out of the AMRIG research project on a kind of cognitive approach to compassion training, a meditation-based approach. And 8 weeks of attention-focused meditation was compared to this compassion meditation training. And what they found was that these two types of training, in comparison to those who were in a health discussion class control group, differently changed brain response to emotional images, this time visual stimuli that were used, during the time that participants were not meditating. So, first of all, it looks as though relatively brief amounts of training, in this case 8 weeks, can make a difference. Secondly, it seems to generalize to the period of time when they're not actively engaging in the meditation. As my former student and postdoctoral fellow Marisa Manchola and I reviewed in a recent paper, there's accumulating evidence that older adults are actually calmer, more emotionally regulated than younger adults, show greater positivity, that is a kind of bias toward more positive information. When we're younger, we have a negativity bias. It serves us well. We're looking for and training ourselves in handling those things that ain't so good, because we're going to need to do that to survive in the world. But as we get older, our attention shifts to the more positive. And studies also showing a faster return to baseline of amygdala activation by neuroimaging in response to negative images. Now, what's interesting about that, theoretically, is that this occurs despite age-related changes which go in the negative direction in these middle frontal brain regions that have been shown to be important for emotion regulation, that are reciprocally interacting with the amygdala. So what happens? How is it that these areas that seem to be responsible for emotion regulation in the brain are actually losing their overall neural mass? One area that there are some reliable changes normatively as we age in brain cell density. How is it that nonetheless we see better regulation as reflected in amygdala activation? And it seems to have to do with kinds of strategy changes that happen as we age. There's something called the socio-emotional selectivity theory. Laura Carstensen and her colleagues at Stanford have been responsible for. Long name that simply refers to the observation that as we get older and the future time horizon is shrinking in relevance to our past, and friends and family members may be dying, that we become more invested in significant, supportive, and close relationships, and more focused upon the positive. And so even though these regulatory responsible brain areas may be losing some of their mass and connectivity, we've changed our strategies and now are focusing on things that are meaningful, supportive, warm, and intimate. Now, that, it seems to us, is a trend that goes in the same direction with some of the things that we see in long-term meditation practitioners. My then graduate student Liz Nielsen and I, in a paper published in 2006, Liz is now a senior program officer at the National Institute on Aging, took a look at middle-aged and older long-term meditators, both of Zen and Vipassana traditions. And what we found is that these meditators, in comparison to a non-meditator control group, reported experiencing greater emotional clarity. On a very long inventory of standard items, they reported being able to discern and distinguish emotions better. And when not meditating, they showed lower physiological arousal as well as greater subtle positive facial expression. We recorded electromyograms from the skin surface of the zygomatic and corrugator muscles, the smile and frown muscles. Greater positive facial expression in response to subliminal emotional pictures. What we did is expose these pictures for only 30 milliseconds. They were emotionally salient. And we preceded and followed them by jumbled photographs cut up in Photoshop, and we spent a year equating them for luminance and color and non-reactivity emotionally to the masks themselves. The result is no one was able to report having seen anything except for one participant, and that one participant was dead wrong in what they reported they thought they saw. So it effectively cuts off the processing very, very early, within 30 milliseconds of when we begin to do the brain's work on an emotional stimulus. So if that kind of change that we can record physiologically with skin conductance response, with facial muscle activity, is occurring that early in the process with only 30 milliseconds of processing those emotional images, then that seems consistent with the greater emotion regulation and clarity of these long-term meditators occurring pretty early in the emotion regulation process. And what we think is that what's happening is a kind of fundamental change, not only in the same direction that I described for normal aging, with a greater positivity bias, greater attending to that which is meaningful, intimate, etc., but also a decrease in that sense of what is self-relevant. If one of the things that happens in long-term meditation is we kind of deconstruct an illusory sense of ourself as being independent, relatively permanent, or at least stable, as having some continuity over time, as we begin to see that that just ain't so. As we sit there and observe what's going on in the stream of consciousness, we see that the only thing that is there is a constantly changing arising of sights and sounds and images and thoughts and feelings. And as that happens, perhaps that sense of what's important or what must be defended against or what is relevant or threatening actually begins to decrease. And that happens very, very early as we begin to process incoming and emotionally relevant information. Other work has shown, in this one example, a randomized controlled experiment, 7 weeks of mindfulness meditation training compared to relaxation training or weightless control, that although both the mindfulness meditators and the relaxation training individuals showed smaller skin conductance, kind of autonomic arousal response to unpleasant pictures, as well as reporting an increased sense of well-being, it was only the mindfulness meditators who showed a reduction in emotional interference from these unpleasant pictures. That is, a kind of bleeding over of that emotional arousal into interfering with performance on a subsequent task that they have to do right after the picture is shown, so that it appears that mindfulness meditation is attenuating, again, our prolonged reactivity to emotional stimuli, much in the same way it seemed to be attenuating our prolonged processing of non-emotional stimuli in that attentional blink experiment. Well, we've been very interested, as have a couple of other groups of investigators, in whether the use of something like mindfulness-based stress reduction, a highly structured 8-week training kind of program, might be of use given the attentional stability evidence, given the emotion regulation evidence, to persons who are really in desperate high-stress situations. And the exemplar that's used in a lot of the stress physiology research literature today is people who are involved in caregiving for persons with dementia. And so a number of recent investigations that I've listed here, including one from our own laboratory that we're still in the process of completing and analyzing, a preliminary report that we made in 2010, showing not only feasibility, that is, we can get people to stay in this 8 weeks of training and practice, that they can comply with the home practice, but that also there's evidence for subjective and physiologic benefit of mindfulness-based stress reduction for these individuals. And our own study, as well as one other, used a randomized control trial kind of design. Now, what still remains unclear is how specific that meditation training actually is. In other words, for example, in our own study, what we saw was that for such things as depression symptoms and perceived stress, the mindfulness-based stress reduction seemed to result in a greater diminution of those symptoms and stress experience in comparison to the relaxation training group. But when we looked at blood pressure, primarily systolic blood pressure and the measures we took, as well as diurnal cortisol response, we saw effects of both the meditation training as well as the relaxation training. So we don't yet know whether meditation really has an advantage over physical relaxation kind of training procedures, but certainly it encourages continuation of that kind of work. So I want to finish up with just taking a look at a couple of other areas outside of the cognitive and emotion physiology domains. And these are all quite new. All of them need to be replicated, even though the research designs are very solid in what's been published so far. So David Creswell and his colleagues took a look at a phenomenon that had been documented previously, and that is that lonely older individuals show an increase in expression of pro-inflammatory genes, as well as an increased risk for illness and death, replicated in a few studies now. They used 8 weeks of mindfulness meditation training and found a reduction not only in the experience of loneliness, and that in and of itself I think is significant, because many other efforts that try to get lonely older individuals engaged in various kinds of social interaction have remarkably failed to reduce their sense of loneliness. And all of you know, if you're feeling lonely, you can feel lonely in crowds. Okay? So loneliness really is a kind of interpretation of the nature of our being. Yeah? It's not something entirely dependent on how much social interaction that we have. So the mindfulness meditation training reduced their loneliness, and it also reduced this related pro-inflammatory gene expression. Now, does this mean that inflammatory response to various pathogens would also be altered? Don't know. This is a kind of basic science investigation, but certainly encourages that other translational work. It's also been very interesting, and when these studies began to be published, the first one in 2005 by Sarah Lazar, I was enormously skeptical. I really didn't expect we were going to see much in the way of structural brain changes. Connectivity changes, physiologic degree of response changes, sure, but actual changes within the structure of the brain, I was pretty dubious about. But what has been found and now replicated, summarized by Grant and colleagues, looking at several different studies, amount of meditation practice is significantly correlated with cortical thickness or volume by structural MRI, particularly in areas important in attention and emotion regulation. In addition, in a study by Pagnoni and Sekic, Zen meditators didn't show the correlation found for non-meditators between age and performance on sustained attention tasks, or between age and brain gray matter volume. So does meditation have some ability to slow this process of brain-related cell changes and how they manifest in sustained attention performance? Suggestive of it, again, much need for continued replication and ever tighter research designs. And the final domain I want to mention has to do with telomeres and cell aging. Telomeres, as some of you know, are DNA protein complexes that are at the ends of chromosomes, kinds of caps on the ends of chromosomes, that predict cell viability and longevity, replicability. As telomeres become shorter, cells age and they die more quickly. Telomeres shorten with age. They've also been shown to shorten with physiologic and psychological stressors, including the stress of caring for someone who has a dementing illness. They also predict early disease and mortality. Now, some of you know about this study by Killingsworth and Gilbert, published in 2010 in Science, entitled "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." 47% of the time, and they used smartphones that were specially designed to go off at various random intervals, and when they did, people would plug in, which sent this information to a site on the internet, answers to 3 short questions. What they found was that 40% of the time, individuals reported their minds wandering. In other words, being somewhere other than on the task that they were focusing on. The only activity for which that mind wandering was below 30% was during sex. Now, that may be encouraging, you know. One would like to think that, you know, mind doesn't wander terribly. Of course, I had to ask, who answers their phone? Who does that? Now, what was interesting is in a study just published by Alyssa Ethel and colleagues, took a look at 239 healthy women. Those who reported higher degrees of mind wandering also showed shorter telomeres. So not only does a wandering mind predict daily unhappiness, even when our mind is wandering to pleasant images or ideation, we're still more unhappy than when our minds are not wandering, when we're attending to a task. But it also seems to be related to the cellular index that's linked to cell aging. Telomerase is enzyme known to repair and lengthen telomeres. And in this Shamatha project, another paper that came out in 2011, this 3-month meditation training compared to the waitlist group showed higher levels of telomerase activity in peripheral blood mononuclear cells by the end of the intensive retreat. So again, very tantalizing results. Confident yet? No, because still more need for replication across different kinds of designs. So in conclusion, and I'll end now here, despite the rapid growth of contemplative science, it's still in an infant stage. A great deal more to be done. We've got a number of studies now that document the amount of meditation practice to be correlated with cognitive, emotional, brain, other biologic measures obtained from self-selected practitioners. But of course, in all of those studies, one can legitimately ask the question, is the meditation producing these phenomena, or is it that people who are characterized by these kinds of things that are measured are the ones who happen to be able to stay with meditation practice for a longer period of time. We don't know what the causal direction is. And so for that, studies that use randomized controlled designs are necessary. We now have some evidence, although a smaller number than those simply looking at extant long-term meditators. But some of these, including those studies with older adults, are now becoming available. Mindfulness-based approaches, I think, at least are holding some promise for enhancing cognitive and emotional functioning as we get older, including for people who are in highly stressful situations. So I think the future of this research has to employ the most rigorous and careful of methods. All of that's going to be necessary to really determine the extent to which that kind of promise can be fulfilled. And so I want to just end with a little plug for a book by Louis Richmond, a Zen meditator and author, that's entitled Aging as a Spiritual Practice, that was published last year. And Lewis's definition of spiritual practice is quite simple. He defines it as paying close attention to the things that really matter. And so I just want to end with that reminder that, you know, most of us don't care terribly much about whether practicing meditation will improve our attention in an attentional blink task. What we do care about is whether we can develop the stability of mind to focus upon what really does matter. And in the third half of our lives, we have now been granted, more so than any other generation in the past, an increased number of years in which to pursue that examination of meaning. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, first thing, for those of you who have things you have to do, please feel free to get up and get to them. But for those who don't, I'm happy to entertain questions and comments for you. Yes, Michael is volunteering to get older.
Given the alternative.
So it's really fascinating, the study looking at a decrease in frontal lobe activity, but yet still a change in the
Greater emotion
regulatory
regulation.
yeah, powers of emotion with the limbic activity. And so what's the evidence that we know of the connection between the frontal regulatory circuits and the limbic circuits in a decline with aging?
Yeah. So that's been pretty well demonstrated. So first of all, as I mentioned, there is evidence from cell density kinds of studies that are done post-mortem, as well as structural magnetic resonance imaging studies of density, that there is a decrease with age that's pretty reliable in that area. Secondly, we do know from both anatomic studies that are done on brains removed from individuals after the time of death, as well as connectivity kind of functional neuroimaging studies, that these two regions are in very close reciprocal relationship. So that's why I said it was so surprising that you actually see this improvement in emotion regulation with aging. And I think what it demonstrates is that anatomy isn't destiny. There are a lot of things that change as we age. My knees and hips are among them. But it doesn't significantly detract from the quality of my life, or necessarily from a number of things that I might do. And so, the lesson of functional substitution and reallocation of attention, I think, is becoming more and more prominent in all of behavioral and neurogerontology.
I am confused between that study that shows as we age there's less density in these regions. And a slide slightly further on where you were showing that Zen meditators have more cortical thickness.
Right.
It's occurring to me that the brain may simply be rerouting. Okay, this is shrinking, but we have more of this over here. It's not doing a lot. We're very plastic. We can retask. We can, you know.
Yeah. That may be the case. I think another possibility, and one which, again, I wasn't willing to entertain a few years ago, is that the way in which we habitually mind our world and ourselves may be systematically related to how the brain changes with age. So, for example, if you look at areas of the brain that in other work that I do with colleagues up in Phoenix, we've shown to be Alzheimer's vulnerable areas. That is, we use positron emission tomography, and we find that in individuals who have genetic vulnerability to Alzheimer's disease carry 1 or 2 copies of the apolipoprotein E4 risk gene. They demonstrate in middle age, when their performance on difficult neuropsychologic tasks is entirely normal, decreased metabolism in those areas. And we also find that now known risk factors like elevations in fasting serum glucose are significantly correlated with the reductions in metabolism in those Alzheimer's vulnerable areas. Well, you take a look at where those areas are, they're quite identical with what's been defined now as the brain's default mode network. And it gets that name from, if you put people in the scanner and you don't give them something to do, what you see is an activation in these particular middle and posterior frontal areas that also are seen when people are mind wandering, that are seen when people are engaged in self-relevant tasks. And so we tend to think of it as a kind of selfing system, or a self-preoccupation system, where, you know, retrieving things from the past, remembering, oh shit, I should have done that yesterday, projecting into the future using that memory. Now, is it possible that to the extent that we're using or overutilizing those systems, they become vulnerable to either age-related changes that are normative or age-related disease processes? Again, I would have said some years ago, no evidence to suggest that's the case. Now what we see in transgenic mouse models of Alzheimer's disease is that in fact brain activity is correlated with the deposition of amyloid plaques in these areas. Mice don't get Alzheimer's disease normally, but you can genetically create a mouse that is vulnerable to those changes. So more deposition of that amyloid during wakefulness than during sleep, greater deposition with greater activity levels. So, again, mildly speculative.
Did you just say that mind wandering is related to getting more plaques in that spot?
No. Because there's no evidence for that in human beings right now. So what there's evidence for is that amount of activity in particular brain areas is correlated in these transgenic mice with deposition of beta amyloid. So it's speculation about whether that has any relevance to human beings, but at least there's reason to ask the question.
Can you define mind wandering?
Yeah, mind wandering is task-irrelevant mentation.
Have you ever correlated that to brainwave activity?
What's that?
Have you ever correlated that to brainwave activity?
Not in my own laboratory, but there's evidence that there is increased desynchronization with mind wandering in comparison to when the mind is focused on some particular task. One of the things that happens when we are consciously aware of some single event is that there is a burst of synchronization, predominantly within this gamma frequency range, 40 cycles per second, when we're engaged in distraction, other kinds of things, mind wandering, there's usually desynchronization. Beta activity is predominant in the EEG. Other things. I'm sorry, yes.
So, all the various results that you showed us are averages, I assume. How heterogeneous are the people who have those results?
Yeah.
Is everybody the same?
No,
or-
not by any means. There is a good deal of variability, but as you saw, with relatively small sample sizes, and that's what's been available in most of the studies so far, there's been sufficient statistical power to find reliable, usually defined 0.05, 0.01 probability kind of results, which means that the variability is not so large that it's masking the ability to detect differences in these average tendencies. So yes, there's variability, but that's why we do statistical analyses and controlled studies to make sure that the effects that we're seeing are greater than chance and then the variability between individuals would otherwise predict. Yeah, Marie.
When you talk about mind wandering, have you talked do you say anything to the people who are having these experiences, whether those are maybe their mind is wandering about some trauma, or if it's their grandchildren, and are there any differences when they report
So,
that?
yeah, thank you. There is a fairly large body of work that was going on most vigorously about 20 years ago on daydreaming that has addressed a lot of those kinds of questions, negative versus positive images, what do people, daydream about? And there's not time to really, kind of tick through the various of the results of that. But your question, does beg another, which is, is mind wandering always a bad thing? It always leads to, unhappiness. And I'd say we have to be really cautious about any such conclusion. So, the degree to which we habitually mind wander seems to be related to our overall degree of unhappiness. However, there is mind wandering that is voluntary, purposeful, and beneficial. When I'm working on a paper or a talk, I will intentionally engage in mind wandering. I will allow myself without constraint to, let whatever arises arise, and then cherry pick whatever seems to be useful or relevant. So I don't think it is the fact that we mind wander. It is whether or not it's habitual and we have some kind of voluntary regulation of it. So I love, daydreaming about my granddaughter and visiting with her and my son. But I have some regulatory ability of that. I can do it when I want to, and I can turn it off otherwise. So it may be more the compulsory dimension of it that's important, but more work has to be done on that.
I always think about when you do writing.
Yeah, creative process is dependent on mind wandering, not constrained. There are some things for which we need, a kind of diamond-pointed focus to do well. Other things where we need to be able to allow all sorts of things to arise.
Along the same line of mind wandering, is it possible that the people who reported that their minds were wandering more were just kind of more self-critical?
Yeah, doesn't seem so, because
How do you control for that?
Yeah. There wasn't an overall sort of negativity. They had a few other self-report things that they did with people at the beginning of the study. This was a very large sample, one of the largest ever collected because of this technology of smartphone probing. So that doesn't seem to be the case, but it's a good question. It seems to be related to really how habitual and there were individual differences that were pretty stable across, you know, different things that they were doing. It seems to be related to how habitual it is for one to mind wander. And the mind wandering was not necessarily onto negative topics, but even when it was on very positive sorts of things, people reported feeling less happy than they did when their minds were not wandering, when they were task focused. And that, of course, goes along with this other body of research on Csikszentmihalyi and colleagues been doing this work on flow, on our ability to, you know, really be in the moment with particular tasks that seems to generate a great deal of satisfaction for most people.
If you are in the moment with your task and just what you said, isn't that a kind of meditation? I mean, actually employing the skills of meditation on the task?
It sure has some family resemblance, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay, yeah, please.
Can you give us a 2-minute summary of other exciting projects related to this kind of research? I assume there's plenty more going on.
So there
Just
are.
to entice us to future
No stress.
presentations.
Some of the work that is looking at immune response and you know, inflammatory gene expression, that's of course a very hot area now. So that's moving forward fairly rapidly. There's some other really exciting work that does relate also to aging that comes out of genomic studies that are now being done with meditators, and the Wisconsin lab is kind of in the lead again with some of that work. So I think those are going to be, you know, some of the things I'd be looking for in the next decade or so as really exciting new stuff. And you know, particularly focused on you know, cellular kinds of possible changes that, you know, again, we sort of pushed off the table before is really not possible. Yeah, maybe we'll take one more.
Al, can you give us an example of inflammatory gene expression?
So there are particular genes that turn on and off proteins in the immune system that are related to inflammation. So things like interleukin-6, for example. And these are part of how our immune system is able to respond to various kinds of foreign pathogens, and occasionally, of course, also to its own tissue in autoimmune kind of diseases. So, you know, this is, you know, again, a very hotly developing area. We have some new people at the university who are studying this, particularly in relationship to physical environments and to stress. So I think we're going to see a lot more work at the U of A in this now, too. One more.
I wanted to thank you and all your colleagues for putting this grand light on the benefits of meditation.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. All right. Thanks for all being here.